hierarchy is not deterministic. You can have the exact same hierarchy over here as over there. I hate to say it, but the primary difference usually lies in how those who have more power or more status in the hierarchy show up. Do they show up as learners? Do they show up and say things like, hey, I might miss something, I need to hear from you?
Humans inherently prefer success over failure, and this is especially true at work, where failure can feel unacceptable. Professor and author Amy Edmondson's recent research reminds us that as fallible human beings, we must understand failure. She says that intelligent failures in organizations help us adapt, improve, and innovate, as individuals and teams. Leaders who recognize, value, and even celebrate failures for the learning opportunities they present encourage organizational innovation and improvement. Dr. Edmondson is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School and the author of The Fearless Organization and several books on teaming. She has published articles in numerous academic journals and in mainstream publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Psychology Today, Fast Company, and Harvard Business Review. She has appeared on the biennial Thinkers 50 Global Ranking of Management Thinkers since 2011 and was ranked first in 2021 and 2023. Her research explores topics such as organizational, team, and individual behavior, psychological safety, collaboration, innovation, learning, and leadership in complex environments to solve challenging problems. Special thanks to today's host, Lori Murphy, Assistant Division Director for Executive Education at the Federal Judicial Center. Lori, take it away.
Well, Amy, we are so delighted to have you today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Many of us know you from your extensive work on the study of psychological safety. Would you remind us what that is and how it led you to study failure?
Psychological safety describes a context where people feel able to take the interpersonal risks of speaking up. Consider something like asking for help or sharing that you've made a mistake or offering a dissenting view. For most people in most workplaces, that feels a little risky. Well, psychological safety describes an environment where you just know it's welcome, it's expected. Not that it's easy, but that it's what we do around here. And it's probably important to say what it isn't, right? It isn't about being nice. It isn't about being coddled. It isn't about lowering expectations for performance. It's truly about a learning environment where we value candor over coddling. And that interest of mine was born of a real desire to understand learning in organizations. How can organizations adapt and improve and innovate as needed in a changing world? That's very hard when people aren't speaking up with their observations, right? How does an organization learn from the observations and ideas of its members if those members are holding them back and not sharing them? So what that has in common with my deep interest in the study of failure is learning. It's all about learning, right? And one of the ways that we learn is from failure. We learn from things that go wrong. It might be a little jargony, but in my field, there's a term, the learning organization or organizational learning, and that captures the ability of an organization to change, to alter what it does to be more effective in a changing world. And so it isn't meant to imply just learning for the sake of learning, armchair learning. It's a kind of learning that is active. So for a long time, I've studied learning in teams. And I don't just mean that the team, sits around and reads textbooks. I mean that the team is experimenting or trying out improvement possibilities and seeing what works and what doesn't. So learning is both a process and a potential outcome, right? A performance outcome that we care about. Innovation is one outcome we care about. Continuous improvement is another outcome we care about. My core argument is it's very difficult to perform well, at least over time, in a changing world unless there's a real commitment to and an enactment of learning along the way.
I'm curious why organizations shy away from failure when failing seems to bring about these innovations and growth?
Well, I think there's sort of two questions embedded in there. And one is, why do we shy away from failure? And I think that one's easy. Probably since the beginning of the species, and certainly since the beginning of each of our lives, we've been socialized to prefer success to failure. And that's not weird, right? That's understandable and normal. We would rather look good than bad. I think the other part of your question was, in a sense, how do we do better? And I think part of the answer to how do we do better comes from a better understanding of the different kinds of failure, when failure is good and helpful and when it's not. And that is a kind of maturity or a skill or all of the above, that ability to override, right? To not fall prey to your first instinct, but to instead pause and do better.
Let's identify some of the terminology. Talk a little bit about the difference between mistakes and failures.
Well, mistakes refer to a process where we deviate from the right way to do something. Right? There's a known process or protocol or recipe, and we do it wrong. We make a mistake. Sometimes those are judgment mistakes. You get in a car and start texting while driving. That's a mistake, right? Don't do it. A mistake only exists when we deviate from the right way of doing something unintentionally. That's a mistake. A failure is a broader category. Failure is an undesired event. So, wow, that's pretty broad. And some failures are indeed caused by mistakes. Again, if I text and drive and get into an accident, that's a failure caused by a mistake. But some failures are not caused by mistakes, right? They're just the undesired results either of bad luck or of, in fact, a thoughtful experiment that didn't end up supporting our hypothesis and instead gave us a failure, not a success.
Let's talk about the three types of failures, the first of which is a basic failure.
And a basic failure has a single cause, usually human error. You leave out an ingredient by mistake of the recipe and the food tastes terrible. And it was caused by a mistake. It was, by the way, as you can see, most basic failures are preventable, theoretically preventable. I mean, when we're really paying attention, we're really vigilant, we're following the recipe, it comes out just right.
Can you give us an example in an organizational context?
A mistake would be someone who is trained in a particular process, let's say operating an infusion pump at a patient's bedside to deliver pain medication, and they just accidentally put the dial in the wrong place and it releases too much of the pain medication. The patient gets an overdose, hopefully not a terribly problematic one, but that's a failure in the treatment and it was caused by a mistake. More often than not, we can catch and correct the human errors that do happen before they actually cause, consequential failure. So that's the basic failure.
What does complex failure look like?
The Notre Dame fire of 2019 is a perfect example of a complex failure. There wasn't one big thing. There wasn't one stupid mistake. There was, by my count, 10 or so deviations from optimal practice, including such things as workers storing their tools where they could have disrupted the wires of electric bells, which maybe shouldn't have been there in the first place, and on it goes, right? Here's a structure that had stood unharmed for more than 1,000 years, but you just get a few things lined up kind of out of perfect place, and they came together to lead to the start of a fire and to the inadequate response to that started fire, and then the rest is history. In my book, Right Kind of Wrong, there's a whole chapter of these kinds of perfect storms.
So is this the Swiss cheese phenomenon?
Yes. So error theorist James Reason calls this the Swiss cheese phenomenon, right? That lovely image where the holes in the cheese can be thought of as little flaws. Now, they don't really harm the cheese doesn't collapse, but he says now and then you can imagine these holes kind of lining up and creating a kind of tunnel, and then the integrity of the cheese is no longer there. Right? But most of the time, those little pockets of not perfect are just fine, right? They don't interact, they don't create a mess, but now and then they come together and create a complex failure. And I think it's clear that we don't want to celebrate complex failures. We do want to learn from them.
What is an ambiguous threat, and how does that play a role in complex failure?
Mike Roberto and I first coined this term, ambiguous threat, in our study of the Columbia shuttle tragedy of 2003. And what we found from just a close look at all of the events, really throughout the shuttle program history, but leading up to this catastrophic complex failure on February 1st, 2003, was very smart, capable individuals, in this case engineers, who were not at all sure, but who were worried about the possibility of a foam strike threat, an engineering anomaly that could create a catastrophic outcome, or, as is more likely the case, not lead to a catastrophic outcome, but be a maintenance issue. So it's literally ambiguous, right? It could be catastrophic, it could be just fine. And it's an ambiguous threat when at least one sane person in your organization has that worry. Our argument is that most of the time organizations underreact to ambiguous threats. Confirmation bias leads us to expect things to work as they normally do, leads me to see all the reasons why it's fine and to actually literally not see so much the factors that might mean it's not fine. Group dynamics, groupthink, psychological safety being low, groups are not particularly good at, without that override function, they're not particularly good at sort of really digging into the ambiguous threats in their midst and saying, ooh, I wonder, is this important? Should we look at it more closely? And then organizational factors, including hierarchy, including production pressure and time pressure, will lead people to underplay, downplay, underreport, not speak up about ambiguous threats, such that they occasionally lead to these catastrophic outcomes. Now, you might say, well, that's just life, but we think differently. We actually think that best practice means that people are really encouraged and motivated to speak up about ambiguous threats, not just clear threats, but ambiguous threats. And when they do, that isn't a kind of a all-alarm event where we all have to stop everything we're doing to dig into it. It's merely an opportunity to learn together, right? To just take a look at it, to amplify it, to give it a voice, not to conclude that it's catastrophic without more thought, but to give it the thought and the attention it deserves to learn, right? And then make a more informed decision. Many of the complex failures that I've studied and that are discussed in the book were both theoretically and practically preventable had people done what we would qualify as best practice.
You have a few memorable phrases that I think are useful for us to consider as we try to implement what you're talking about. Catch and correct, stop, challenge, choose. Can you tell us more about both of those?
So catch and correct refers to that opportunity that is ever present to notice an error. Most errors don't instantly produce a failure. There's a time lag. If you're driving and you start texting, someone else in your vehicle could just take away your phone. They've caught your error. They've corrected it before something really bad happened. In hospitals today, patient safety is considered not to be something that's produced by perfect people, but something that is produced by vigilance and awareness and teamwork, where if I happen to notice an error and you missed it, I don't hesitate to speak up and then basically do the thing needs to be done to make sure no one is really hurt by it. Thank goodness. If you're the error maker, you will appreciate my help, and if I'm the error maker, I'll appreciate yours.
But we also need to ensure that the person who is catching those errors or mistakes is not punished for doing so, that in fact that's part of the way we do business.
It is so important, right? That people need to not feel punished, embarrassed, humiliated, ashamed for making mistakes, because we all make them.
I look at this, catch and correct is I've got your back.
Right. It's the ordinary good practice in any complex work environment. Right? If you are doing something utterly routine and predictable and repeating, whatever, still might need to catch and correct. But if you're in the court system or if you're in the medical care system, I guarantee you that there are opportunities to catch and correct that will make performance better, simply because of the nature of the work. Stop, challenge, choose is a practice, almost more of a self-reflective practice. When something happens that immediately our thought processes start to spiral out of control in an unhealthy or unhelpful way, you also can catch and correct yourself. So what does stop, challenge, choose mean? Stop refers to just, if you start going, oh my God, this is awful and I'm going to be fired, just pause, take a deep breath, interrupt the automaticity of your thinking, your negative thinking. Challenge it. Take a look at it. What are you saying? This is awful. The world's going to come to an end. You're going to lose your job. How true is that really? Challenge the logic or the rigor of that automatic thinking, and then choose an alternative that is likely more productive, more healthy, more helpful. You're trying to get in the habit of improving your own thinking and your own emotional responses to the various events that happen at work or happen in your life, so that you can be a better learner and be healthier and happier. What I describe in the book and what this discipline is really about is just becoming more thoughtful responders to the events of our lives and our work.
To be more comfortable ourselves
Yes.
with inevitable failures.
And some of them aren't even failures, right? Some of them are false alarms. And you think, oh my God, I missed that deadline, and you're spiraling out of control. And then you check your schedule and it's like, oh no, it's actually tomorrow, I'm fine. But let's say you did miss the deadline. Then, yeah, that's inconvenient, but it's not the end of the world. The tagline of the chapter where I describe this practice is really choose learning over knowing. And sometimes our knowing takes a form that's just unhelpful to us. I know that this means I'm a complete idiot and I'll never work again. Well, that's actually not true. That's automatic thinking, but it's neither true nor helpful.
Maybe the catch and correct is more where the hierarchy could come in and the power differential could be more challenging to individuals actually speaking up.
Hierarchy is indeed a risk factor, but hierarchy is not deterministic. You can have the exact same hierarchy over here as over there, but the way it's being handled and thought about is totally different, and therefore its impact on people's ability to learn and grow and speak up is different. And I hate to say it, but the primary difference usually lies in how those who have more power or more status in the hierarchy, how they show up, right? Do they show up as learners? Do they show up and say things like, hey, I might miss something, I need to hear from you? Do they show up and appreciate that beautiful quality report you did yesterday? Do they share some of their thinking so that you know what's going on and you're better able to do your part? I think thoughtful leaders are aware of the risks that hierarchy creates for learning and potential failures that are preventable, and they do their best to override it, right? They do their best to mitigate the risks by being approachable, by being thoughtful, by asking people what they're noticing and seeing, by responding in a productive way.
And it sounds like it's being overt and saying out loud some things so that those they're leading know that it is safe to speak up, that speaking up is valued, that there's an intentionality there that's needed. It's not enough for a leader to just believe that inside. They have to do and say some things to make that clear to those they lead.
Yes, exactly right. I can't tell you how many executives I've talked to who say, oh, I have an open door policy. I promise you, I'm sitting outside the door and nobody's going in, nobody's going out, right? It's not enough to believe you have an open door or that you are approachable or that you are learning oriented. You must verbalize it. You must say some of that quiet part out loud, like, I might miss something, or I'm really interested, really appreciative, you're my eyes and ears, whatever it is, right? Say it out loud. And I want to be clear about this. This isn't about being soft or warm or weak. It's really very firm and tough, meaning we are so committed to the highest possible standards around here. And I know I'm going to miss something. I know you're going to miss something. Only by our really communicating at the highest level of clarity and candor are we going to be the high-performing unit we want to be, right? It comes from a place of ambition. It comes from a place of recognition that we're vulnerable, right? We're vulnerable to breakdowns, and therefore, I want to get out ahead of them. And I know I can't do it myself, right? I don't have all the answers, and I'm not a perfect person. I'm a fallible human being who's dependent on my staff for getting it right.
And it's not enough to just do that once. When I read in your book about surgical teams, every time there's a surgery, the surgeon, who is the power person in that operating room, has to do this every time.
Every time. Because there's too much at stake. I interviewed a pilot who said that he greets every new cockpit crew by saying, I've never flown a perfect flight, and it won't happen today either. Right? He's saying it out loud, right? I need you. I need you to tell me when I've made a mistake. I need you to catch and correct. I mean, that's
powerful.
Yeah, it's powerful.
So there's a right kind of wrong, as your book title implies, and it's like the sweet spot of failure, which you call intelligent failure, because that's the kind of failure we want to embrace.
Right. So intelligent failures are the only good kind. The other two are not good. They are, when we're at our best, preventable. So an intelligent failure basically is the undesired result of a thoughtful experiment. And we don't need to do thoughtful experiments in well-paved territory. We can use the great knowledge that we have, but we do need to be willing to engage in thoughtful experiments or smart risks in new territory. It's not that we would ever prefer the failure to the success, but we need to learn to truly embrace those failures, to truly value them for the unique and new knowledge they bring, new knowledge that simply couldn't have been gained any other way.
Can you give us an example to make this a little more concrete?
I'll give you two. One is a scientist in a laboratory or an inventor in a laboratory who has read the literature, smart scientist in her field, and has articulated a hypothesis that she has good reason to believe could be right. You know, the chemicals might behave this way. Do all the work of the experiment, you wait for whatever long period of time you have to wait or short period of time, and then lo and behold, it failed. It didn't support the hypothesis. Disappointing, but it's still new, valuable new knowledge. Let's say in ordinary life, you're looking for a life partner. You've got a good friend who believes that their friend would be someone you might really like. You agree to go out for coffee with this friend. There's good reason to be willing to invest an hour of your time, in this coffee, right? And there's no chemistry or there's no spark. You don't like each other. It's a failure, right? It's not the beginning of, the love of your life. So it's a failure, but it sure is intelligent. Now, if you had agreed to go on a 2-week vacation with this stranger and it failed, that would not be intelligent. It's too big. What I'm saying is so intuitive, and I shouldn't even need to say it, except that in organizations, we see these principles violated all the time, right? You're in new territory and you're investing way more than is healthy or smart in an unproven technique. Or you're in new territory and you haven't bothered to do your homework and find out what do we know, what do we not know, what's worth testing, right? So I just found that it was helpful to kind of articulate almost the formula for what is the right kind of wrong. Because there's no way to make progress in new territory without being willing to experiment, and we won't be right all the time.
So there's an element of risk, and we want to take the smallest risk we can to test whatever it is we're trying out. And we need to do that on a regular basis to move things forward.
Exactly. It's subjective and it's a judgment call, but needless to say, you wouldn't invest your entire life savings in an uncertain outcome, or you shouldn't.
So how can leaders encourage more of this intelligent risk, which might lead to intelligent failure, right? It might lead to intelligent success. You don't know until you experiment.
Yep. Here's how. I think it starts with articulating, maybe again and again, but the compelling purpose that we share, that we work toward. Whether it's justice or high quality safe care or innovative new products, whatever it is, you're putting the bar high where it belongs. Like, here's what we're trying to do, and then you're acknowledging that there are gaps in our current ability to deliver on that reliably, successfully every time, and you're making sure that people understand they really do have room and permission to experiment a little bit to help us get where we're trying to go. You reward intelligent failures. I don't mean you write a check. I mean you sort of say, wow, that's such valuable new information. Thanks for bringing it to us. You make it a positive experience because it isn't naturally positive. None of us like to fail. And lastly, you share the results of that intelligent failure with everyone on the team or in the company so that we now have that in our bank. We don't want someone else in our team producing the same intelligent failure that we just got already. Bringing people together to share that knowledge is a great way to both celebrate it and share the knowledge.
Yeah. But for this failure, we would not have learned this thing.
Right. Now we know what doesn't work. You're trying to build a learning environment that allows and enables learning behavior so that we can get better over time.
So we want to be successful. We want to celebrate success. And hopefully we're having more successes than failures. But when we're having failures, hopefully more of them are intelligent failures than basic or complex failures. Amy, what else do you think judiciary leaders should know about learning to fail well that we haven't already discussed?
Well, the last chapter in the book is called Thriving as a Fallible Human Being. So I want to come back to that idea that none of us can opt out of being a fallible human being. That's the curriculum, right? We arrived on this earth as fallible human beings, and we are going to be those for the duration of our lives. We can always strive, and I do, to do better, to make fewer mistakes, right? To be more generous, to be more effective, but we will slip up, right? So that's, I think, being just acutely aware of that as a given allows you to be more fully sort of human and connected to your colleagues, right? Because if you're aware of that about yourself, you'll show up with a sort of humility and humor that will make it more fun to work with you. And excellence will come from that.
That chapter gave me great comfort, I will say that. Amy, where can we learn more about you and your work?
Short answer, amycedmondson.com. I've got articles and links to books and articles and things. And also you can always go to Harvard Business School and to my faculty page as well. Excellent.
Well, Amy, this has been fun and fascinating. I hope not a failure. I don't think so. But it's given me a lot of food for thought, and I think our listeners as well. So thank you so much.
I've loved talking with you.
Thanks, Lori, and thanks for listening. For more episodes, visit the podcast link at fjc.dcn/EE. You can also listen and subscribe to the podcast via Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. All episodes are also available on fjc.gov, including episode 13, in which Dr. Edmondson discussed her research on psychological safety. In Session, Leading the Judiciary is produced by Shelley Easter. Our program is supported by Angela Long, Jamie Mitchell, and the entire studio and live production team. We'd like to especially thank Senior Production Director and Editor Craig Bowden for working on this podcast since its inception, and wish him well as he retires shortly after this episode initially airs. Until next time. This podcast was produced at U.S. taxpayer expense.